So these are my sections from week 1, and before we get sewing on our block today, we're going to give them a quick press with a nice dry hot iron. We pre-shrunk our stabilizer before we started, so we shouldn't have any shrinkage problems. You're not going to want to use any spray starch with this, because guess what? It'll dissolve your wash away thread and you'll lose your stitching line. So get them pressed and ready to go. Week 2, so here are the things you'll need. Obviously your instructions. You'll need your battleizer hooped up and ready to go. If you're doing the wool, you'll need your optional wool. We'll need the block back, 2 triangles of fabric 1, 2 triangles of fabric 2, triangle of fabric 4, and then you'll need each of your sections from last week. You'll need water-soluble thread, embroidery bobbin, you'll need your quilting thread, and you will also need a bobbin in your quilting thread. So let's get started. Step 1 is our battleizer is hooped up and on the machine, and we place some water-soluble thread in the needle, and we're going to go ahead and stitch your placement stitch. Step 2 is to take the optional wool batting, place it inside the placement stitch, and let it stitch the tack down. If you're not doing the wool batting, you can skip this step. Step 3 is to continue with our water-soluble thread in the needle, and the machine will stitch some placement stitches on top the wool batting if you're using it. If you're using wool batting, a good tip to try is to raise your presser foot a little bit higher so it'll clear the batting and not get caught. Step 4 will be to take the smaller triangle of fabric 1 and place it over this section right here. And we want to try to have even seam allowances on all 3 sides, and you can kind of feel that through your wool. So once you get it placed, let the machine tack down fabric 1. Step 5, we're going to switch out our water-soluble thread with a neutral thread in the needle. We are going to take our triangle of fabric 4 and place it right side to the last piece of fabric with your raw edges even, and we will stitch the seam. Step 6, we'll continue with the same thread. We'll flip this triangle right side up, smooth it out, and let the machine tack it down. Before moving on, I'm going to trim my little dog ears here. A little bit extra fabric that I really don't want in there. If your seam allowances are larger than 1/4 inch, which mine are fine, you could go ahead and trim yours. So now we're ready for step 7. So for step 7, we're going to take our triangle of fabric 2, one of them, place them right sides together with fabric 4 with your raw edges even, and we'll let the machine stitch the seam. Step 8, we're going to change back to our water-soluble thread in the needle only. We're going to flip this fabric piece right side up and smooth it out, and with the water-soluble thread, the machine will tack it down. For step 9, we're going to change back to our neutral thread in the needle only, We're going to take fabric 2, place it right side to fabric 4 with your raw edges even, and stitch the seam. For step 10, we're switching back once again to our water-soluble thread. We will flip fabric 2 right side up, smooth it out, and with the water-soluble thread, we'll tack it down. Before moving on to step 11, you're going to want to check your seam allowance here and make sure you have a scant 1/4 inch. I'm going to trim mine just a little bit and get rid of this dog ear too. For step 11, we are changing back to our neutral thread in the needle only, and we'll take our last and largest triangle of fabric 1 and place it wrong sides to the last set of stitching here with your raw edges even, and we'll let the machine stitch the seam. For step 12, we're changing back to our water-soluble thread in the needle only. We'll flip fabric 1 right side up, smooth it out, and we'll let the machine tack it down with the water-soluble thread. For step 13, we're going to use match points to match up this seam with this seam. And we put a little step in there that will stitch just a couple stitches to try it out first. And what happens is, if I lower my needle, hopefully you can see that it's going to put a stitch right where that match point is. So the idea is we will line up our section 2 from week 1 with that. So I'll show you how to do that next. Our next step, step 13, gives us match points to match up this intersection where the pin is to this intersection on the block. So just so you can see where to put it, I put a pin through there, and when I turn it over, you can see right where that pin comes out. So the idea is to match up this with where the needle drops. So I will place my section 2 from week 1, the side with the 1/4 inch is placed on top of the block, and the other shorter side with a 1/4 inch is over on this side. The 1/2 inch sides are here because those will end up being the outside edge. And I want to drop my needle exactly where that pin came out, where I showed you earlier, right on the stitch line. And that's where it needs to tack it. So once I drop it and get it in place, I raise up my needle and I hit the start button, and I let it stitch that little match point for me. So now we get to flip it over and see how it matches. So we'll flip it up and take a look, and I can see that my seam matches up very well. There's a placement stitch that's stitched right here that will align with this seam, so you can kind of judge it that way as well as where your points match. So if it doesn't match, you can just pull it back, cut out those couple of stitches, and take another run at it. So the next step is step 14. It's to stitch the seam across. So I'm going to come back and show you how to align it and what to do next. For step 14, we're going to switch back to our neutral thread in our needle. And a good tip is to slow your machine down, the speed of it, as much as possible, because we're stitching a seam and we want to make sure it matches. So we're going to go slow with this one. If I drop my needle down just by turning my hand wheel, I can align the unit's basting stitch around the outside edge with my needle drop. That's right where I want it to be. Hopefully you can see that. So now that I have it where I want, I'll just hold it down, let it stitch the seam, and I've slowed my machine down. When I get to my match point, I'm going to stop it. And then I'm going to align this side. So I'll just turn it back, and I can see my basting line from my unit is lining up with the basting line from the block underneath. And I'll just fold that back. I can also use these placement stitches we did earlier, and I can see that this placement stitch is lined up pretty good here. It's lined up great, and then same with this one. So I can kind of see where I'm going. And then I'll start it again. And there we have it. For step 15, we'll change back to our water-soluble thread, and we'll flip our unit 2 right side up. And you need to, especially if you have wool, you need to give it a little bit of pressure to hold it down nicely, and we'll let the water-soluble thread tack down your piece. And I still have my machine slow because I want to have time to hold this down and not get in the way of the presser foot. I'm going to point out that when it tacked down unit 2, this is my tack down, this outer stitching line here. This inner one, if you can see it, is my tack down from stitching unit 2. So this is the line that I want to follow for our next step. Also, I'd like to point out, we digitize this so that you might see some water-soluble thread in your seam line area. And that's why we had you use water-soluble thread, so it'll wash out later. But we made these tack down lines sew on top of each other so that you would have a seam allowance to follow when you're applying your units. So this will wash out later, so don't be concerned about that. So now we're ready for step 16, which is another match point right here. Your match point is right here. So for step 16, we need to align this match point with this one. So just an easy way for you to find it is to take a pin, put it through right at that intersection, and you can hopefully see right where the pin comes out. If it's easier for you, you can take maybe a friction pen or something and make a little dot there. I used a red ink. We're also, just for future, the next step, you're going to need to align this part right here. So we can go ahead and do the same thing. Put your pin through there and make a little dot with the friction pen right where it needs to go. So I'm going to put these right sides together, and I'm going to have my needle drop right there on that dot. So I'm continuing with my water-soluble thread. I've lowered my needle so it just hits my match point that I'm aiming for. And then I'll let it stitch that. And this is step 16. You can check it if you'd like. I'm going to be brave and go right on to step 17, and I'm going to lower my needle at that match point. Now it's time to flip it over and see how we did. So it's time to check out our match points. So we'll flip our piece over, and that one looks really good, and so does this one. This is 16, this is 17. So step 17 now, or step 18 I should say, is to put the neutral thread back in the needle. We'll flip this back over, and we're going to stitch the seam by lining up our needle drop at the top, slowing it down, and letting it stitch slowly as we go. So for step 18, I'm going to lower my needle right at the top intersection of my basting stitch from my section 2 or section 3 and align it with the seam line. And then I'll let it stitch the seam. Again, I'm sewing nice and slow. And when I get down to this match point, I'm going to go ahead and stop it. And then just turn it back and make sure this basting line lines up with this basting line. And then just hold it in place and let it finish the seam. So for step 19, we're going to change back to water-soluble thread in the needle. We'll flip our piece right side over and smooth it out and let the machine tack it down. Step 20 is to turn the hoop over, place the back, and continue with water-soluble thread and let the machine baste the back on. Step 21 is your final step, and you will change to thread A in the needle and the bobbin and stitch the quilting. When you begin your quilting, you want to make sure you go into your machine settings and turn off your thread cutter if it's on. And you want to bring up your bobbin thread by touching your needle up and down and bringing up your bobbin thread and holding it. And after it starts, you can go ahead and cut it. This will make for a nice clean back on your quilt. So here's our finished block. It's time to trim it up. It does go in the center of your mystery quilt, as you can see in your directions right here. So all four sides will get trimmed with the metal edge of the Trimmer by George. So here's my metal edge, and I will turn back my outside edge and shimmy that metal edge up to it. And with a 60mm cutter, I will rotary cut off the battleizer and the backing. And I will do that on all four sides. And then after the battleizer and the backing is cut off, there's a look at the back. We turn the trimmer over and we align the 1/4 inch with the basting line and we trim the outside edges. So you will make 4 of these, and as I said, it'll go in the center of your quilt. So let's see if we can put these together for you. So there's a look at the center of your mystery quilt. So here we have our 4 blocks from week 2, and we can go ahead and stitch them together before we move on to the next week's blocks. I've already stitched these 2 seams together, and I've pressed my seams opposing each other. So one's going one way, one's going the other way. So now it's time to put these 2 right sides together, and I'll show you how we match up our seams. The match points we did when we did our sections, same with when we pin them together to sew our seams. I'll put a pin through the center seam, and then I'll place it in the seam on the next set of blocks. I'll pinch the 2 together, take a second pin, and I'm putting it in the seam allowance, and that first pin, I'm taking it out, putting it in the seam allowance. So now my 2 seam allowances are pinned in the direction they need to go. My next match point will be right here. It's good to use some really sharp pins for this. I have, they're actually silk pins, but they're very, very sharp. So I'll put a pin right where I want it to match. And then again in the opposite side, right at that point, pinch the 2 together. Take a second pin and put it in. My next match point will be here. So we'll put it right where that seam is, and again on the opposite side, pinch the two together and put the pin in. Last place on this side would be the corner. We've got the pin going right into the corner. Pinch them together. Take a second pin and put it in. And I would like to point out that my raw edges may not necessarily match. What's important is the pin is in the match point. That's what's important, is that the seam matches, not necessarily the raw edges. A little bit different than regular quilting. So now we'll just follow along with this side. We'll put a pin right in the match point. And you can see my raw edge is not going to match up, but that's fine. Second pin. Now this match point. Second pin. And now the corner. So now I have my whole seam pinned. I'll take it to the sewing machine, and I like to use a walking foot when I stitch these seams. And I like my stitch length to be a little bit long. I usually set it for 3.0. So we'll be right back after the seam is stitched. I'm going to go ahead and prepare my sashing for the back of my blocks. And on the back of your Trimmer by George ruler, there is a sashing line marked, and that's 1.5 inches. So you can go ahead and use that to cut your strips. So just for today, I'll cut a few strips just to show you how to do it. But if you got the time, go ahead and cut them all. Get them all stitched together into one long piece. And then we can sash the back of your blocks. So I've gone ahead and stitched together my sashing strips with a diagonal seam. I pressed the seams open and I ran it through a bias tape pressing gadget and pressed the seams or the raw edges to match in the middle. So now I can go ahead and apply it to my block. And you can do a couple different methods. Wonder tape is easy. You could use a little fabric glue. So I'll take the Wonder tape and I'll start right at the edge of my block, just shy of it actually, and I'll put the edge of the tape right next to the seam, all the way across. And when I get to the other end, I break the tape off right before the seam. I don't want it to go into the seam because we don't need the bulk there. And then we can peel off the paper back. And now we'll take the sashing that's been prepared and we'll open out one side and we'll put the raw edge right next to the seam. And notice I'm staying shy of my seam allowance, like 1/8 inch. We don't want the bulk into the seam allowance. So we'll just press that down right onto the Wonder tape with the raw edge of the sashing right next to the basting line of the seam. And at this end, turn it back and cut it off about 1/8 inch from the seam line. And that side's ready to go. And I can go ahead and do this side as well, or the cross side as well. Same thing, right next to the seam line. right over the other sashing. And I'll break it off right before the seam line. Peel off the paper back. And I will put that raw edge of the opened out sashing right next to the stitching line and keep it about 1/8 of an inch from the seam down here. And if you go ahead and sash your blocks like this every week, it'll be much easier in the end to put it together because a lot of it will be done. So at this end, we'll turn it back and trim it off about 1/8 of an inch from the seam line. So I'm now ready to stitch this down. I'm going to use a walking foot, of course. I'm going to choose a stitch like a serpentine stitch that'll travel along the edge of each side of my sashing. I will use monopoly in my bobbin because that'll show on the front side, and I'll use whatever thread I want to match my sashing in the needle. So I'll be right back and show you how it looks. So here's my finished center of our mystery quilt for 2016 in the beginning, and you can see I've stitched my sashing down. You can see the little serpentine stitch, hopefully, and that's the monopoly thread. On the back, you can see I used a color in my bobbin to match my bobbin thread from my quilting. So you can go ahead and do this to the center of your quilt, and then you'll be ready to join it to the next section.